Good afternoon. I'm deeply grateful to be here to participate with all of you in this General Assembly and to join the global church in her proclamation and her prayer, "Your kingdom come." But I'm also quite humbled to stand here and speak with all of you about matters of leadership as I look around the room and I see myself surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, of leaders of the church and church organizations from all around the world. I say it's humbling because I think that leadership is quite complicated. And I don't mean the managerial side of leadership, the casting of vision, the strategizing, assessing performance, even though these come with their own challenges. But I'm referring to the people side of leadership, the people whom we lead and the people whom we lead with. Leadership is complicated because it deals with people. Every time you interact with another human being, it's an act of building a bridge and then daring to take the step to cross that bridge at your own risk. And these bridges are many, and they're complex. There's the bridge called personality types with their endless variations. There's another bridge called gender distinctives, and that one is really complicated. There's another bridge called cultural norms, and there's another bridge called age characteristics based on what stage of life the person is in. And then tonight we add another bridge, the generational trends bridge. So every time two human beings interact with one another, there's at least one, if not several, bridges that need to be crossed. Multiple bridges between these two people in every single interaction. And what adds to the complexity of our communication with one another is that one misstep on one of these bridges can actually result in the shaking up of all the other bridges. People are complex, and leadership is complicated. And all of this, and I haven't even mentioned the effect of the fall on our communication, on disrupting all of these bridges. I haven't yet mentioned sin's relentless mission to distort the image of the person who's across from us on the other side of the bridge. In the beginning, the Lord declared, "It is not good for Adam, for human to be alone." I think that was more true in pre-fall Eden than it is today. Sometimes as leaders, all we want to do is just to be alone. It's actually quite good to be alone, just to get a break from this constant task and challenge of bridge building and bridge crossing. And yet, the words of our Lord are true. It is not good for humans to be alone. To aid us in our understanding today in the topic of intergenerational leadership, we are going to need to seek the advice and the wisdom of social scientists, the ones who study generations, the ones who help us understand the external factors that affect the cultural values and the social practices of each generation. Now, I'm not going to go in details about the characteristics and trends of each generation because I'm so grateful to have received this in my bag as soon as we arrived here. And I know that each one of you already got it. This is an incredible issue of the newsletter of the Asia Evangelical Alliance. And it deals with this topic of intergenerational leadership at great detail and depth. Many of the authors in the newsletter have also been plenary speakers in the assembly. So I encourage you to read the several articles that are written here on this topic, just to save us some time today in mentioning all the different trends and characteristics. However, for the sake of you who are not familiar with this topic of generational trends or generational characteristics, let me simply give a glimpse of what each generation is characterized by. In general, social scientists are speaking of 5 generations. 4 of them are mostly present in the workplace today, and these are the ones that we study at depth. The very first generation, and it's the oldest one, is called the traditionalists. And by the way, just so you know, as you read different material on this issue of intergenerational leadership, you will realize that not all social scientists group them exactly. Generally, the generations span between 15 and 20 years, and some of them call them different names, so it will be a bit confusing as you study it. Social scientists have split up the generations into these 5 generations. The traditionalists, the ones who are older than 75 years old. They're hardworking, and they're late to retire, and yet some of them have retired, while very few are left in the workforce. The next generation, they call baby boomers. And they're between ages 60 and 75, and they're still in the workplace. The next generation is Generation X, and they range between the ages of 40 and 60 years old. The next generation is Generation Y, and some researchers have also called them the millennials, and they range between ages 25 and 40. And the next generation is Generation Z, or Z, depending on where you're from, and it ranges between ages 15 and 25 years old. Just a brief word about each of these generations, because they are among our leadership teams in our churches if we have intentionally made room for them. The baby boomers, the one word that would describe them is that they are competitive. Bigger is better. And that is the effect of the era that they grew up in, the external influences that shaped who they are as a generation. They want to be honored for their experience, acknowledged for their legacy, and they love to be asked but never told. They're driven by independence, titles, money, and power. Generation X, the 40s to 60s, the one word that describes them is that they are adaptive. They look for work and life balance because they grew up with parents who were too hardworking. So they're looking for work and life balance. They love to develop themselves in many areas, and so they have multi-interests. They love to be recognized for their educational skills because in general, they tended to be more educated than the generation before them. They are driven by speed, creativity, and flexibility. If you want the best out of them in their leadership role, in their workspaces, then give them flexible time and give them flexible spaces. If you put them in charge of designing or building a new room, they will always think of the multifunctional, multi-purpose room. They love flexibility. The next generation is Generation Y, or otherwise known as the millennials. And they are ages 25 to 40. The best word to describe them is multitaskers. And that's because they're the internet generation. They open a tab and let it download while they open another tab, while they open another tab on the internet server. They're multitaskers. They can watch TV while they're holding the phone, while they're on the computer, while they're having a conversation. They want to be recognized for everything because they're the generation where a shift happened in our educational policies and philosophies that we're supposed to raise a generation of high-esteem children. And so they were given credit for anything and everything. They call them sometimes the trophy generation. And so they want to be recognized for everything. They want to be kept busy because for them, they think in terms of actions, not ideas, not philosophies. It's all about doing. They love transparency, and we'll explain why that is later. And along with that, they want to be able to to trust others. They're driven by social interaction and networking. They're the ones who buzz around the room and around coffee break trying to make networking happen. They're driven by a paycheck that doesn't necessarily need to reflect their work, but it does need to pay for all of their external interests outside the work. And that makes it really difficult to have them be content with their paycheck. The last generation is Generation Z, ages 15 to 25. The best word to describe them is that they are digitally savvy. And because of that, they're super optimistic about the world. They think they can change it to much better because every time their fingertip touches something, it happens. They look for convenience. They look for innovations. They don't look outside the box, they live outside the box. But they long for deep connections. They're driven by social media, mostly because of their fear to be left alone. They're driven by purpose-driven work, and they're driven by workplaces that offer learning opportunities and personal development. These are the generations, just a quick glimpse of them, but again, I encourage you to read more about them in detail in this newsletter from the Asia Evangelical Alliance. These cohorts, these generations, have been affected by certain historical events during their time that have helped shape the thinking and acting of the whole generation. For example, a generation was affected by the economic depression in the US and in Europe, and another generation was affected by the Arab Spring in North Africa and in the Middle East. Some of these events can be even more global and have a bigger influence on various generations across the globe, like the 2 world wars or the technological revolution. But even some of these global events that have shaped the nations around the world, some of them affect these different generations differently based on geography. Let me give you 2 current examples. The first example comes from the asylum seekers that are standing as we speak at the border between Mexico and the US. The millennials who live in America are affected by this much differently than the millennials from Guatemala on the other side of the border. Similarly, an event like 9/11, which changed the security system of airports worldwide, they have resulted in making Western Gen Xers feel much more secure whenever they travel or cross borders, while making the Arab Gen Xers feel much more threatened when they do the same. Every generation has something valuable to offer, and yet when you study them deeply, you will notice that there aren't great differences in what each generation wants. However, there are great differences in how they go about getting what they want. And so it's important that we realize who is on our team, who is in our workplace, who's in our ministry, so that we know what each generation can offer. Now, having said that, I want to warn you that as leaders, we deal with people, not generations. It's good to know something about the social effects and the cultural practices that have influenced every generation, and yet at the end, human-to-human interaction is what's key. Don't fall into the trap of labeling people simply because they belong to a certain generation. Just like decades ago, we used to fall into the trap of labeling people based on their race or their gender. As a social psychologist, I assure you that people will always surprise us. I want to focus in the next few minutes on 2 deep longings that the younger generations share, especially those who belong to Generation Y, the millennials, and to Generation Z. These two young generations have a deep, deep longing to these two essential things in life. And as I say them, some of you who belong to other generations, you will feel like, well, this is my deep longing too. It's true. It's not about the differences of what we want. It's about how we as different generations go about getting these things that we long for. The first thing that Generation Y and Z are longing for is to belong. Is simply to belong. To connect at a deep level with another human being, with another community that is transparent, that is trusting. The time that we grow in define our communication, and our ways of communication help shape our relationships. Communication is a building block in all relationships. And so the time that we grow up in helps shape to what level we're going to connect and to what level we will feel like we belong. When we study communication, we know that every communication channel has three major components: the content of what's being said, the tone of voice, and the facial expressions. Some of you will remember that the channel of communication 100 years ago was letter writing. It was basically content written in black ink, put on white background, which back then was paper, and delivered. Simply content, no vocal tone, no facial expression. But at least it was a way to feel close to one another when we're distant from each other. And then communication channels progressed, and we came up with the telephone. And the telephone replaced text with voice to communicate content and tone of voice. And telephones brought us closer. And then we invented video calling. And video calling added image, facial expression, to the tone of voice to express the content. And that brought us even closer when we were far from each other. One would have suspected technology to progress in the direction of adding more senses to our communication. That I could be away from home and still smell my mother's cooking. That I could be traveling and still touch the soft cheek of my baby. But that's not what happened to communication. In fact, we reverted back to letter writing. Except this time, it's not black ink, it's typed texts. And it's not on a white background of paper, it's on a white background of a screen. And once again, we have lost the facial expressions and the tone of voice. Back to content that we spend too much of our time trying to clear up misunderstandings of. Trying to explain ourselves because somebody didn't hear our tone of voice or didn't see our facial expression. And so the direction of the progression in our communication technology actually created regression in our sense of belonging. Our smartphones may have been getting smarter, but sadly, our interactions were growing dumber. We've gained DQ, digital intelligence, but we have lost EQ, emotional intelligence. This is one of the blessings and curses of the digital revolution. A second blessing and curse of the digital revolution is personalization. It's a blessing because now products and services are tailored to our preferences and our needs. Think of the plane that you came on if you came flying to this conference. You had your own screen, and you could choose whatever it is that you wanted to watch or play or listen to. Some of you may remember a time when we used to ride planes and there was just one movie that showed on a shared screen. Some of you remember that? It wasn't personalized, but there was a shared experience. When a funny scene came on, the whole plane laughed at the same time. There was a shared experience. Personalization is the blessing of the progression of our technological revolution. However, the curse is isolation, the absence of a shared experience. I was traveling recently with my boys and the 17 and 15-year-old who belong to the Z generation. I was delighted to see them as they were sitting next to each other cue the movie that they wanted to watch together exactly so that they would have that shared experience on the plane. They're starting to feel the need to belong. A third curse and blessing of this digital revolution is convenience. It's very convenient to have an abundance of choices. The curse is that it has led to much confusion, so much so to a point where some of our young people are paralyzed to make the right choices. Consumer reviews will give you advice on products that don't necessarily suit you, but they suit the image they want you to become. They want you to desire. The fourth blessing and curse of this digital revolution is speed. Instant gratification. But that has led to high levels of impatience, high levels of rage, because things are not happening at the speed that we want them to happen. Customer services hotline representatives, they get yelled at by this generation more than any other generation. This speed, this blessing and curse, presents a real challenge to disciple making. Try to practice the spiritual disciplines instantly. Try to become a disciple fast. It doesn't work. You can't produce fruits fast enough for this generation, for them to believe that they're really being formed into the image of Christ. Google can give them answers, but it can't help them ask the right questions. Mentors are needed for that, to help them distinguish the difference between knowledge and wisdom. In this age of DQ, of personalization, of convenience and speed, at the touch of a screen, EQ, emotional intelligence, cannot be microwaved and cannot be delivered to your home by Amazon by 10 a.m. the next day. Belonging comes through relationships and is best done in intergenerational settings, not multi-generational settings. Multi-generational is when they exist in the same space and time, but they're not interacting, like the case in many of our churches. Intergenerational is where there is real transparent interaction between them. Let me say one more thing, and I beg you to receive this in as much grace as available. Everyone wants to belong. Intergenerational, intentional, holistic discipleship needs to also be inclusive. I was quite delighted to see the inclusion in terms of race and culture in the opening photo at the moment of striking the gong. And I was happy to see gender and age inclusion in every other aspect of the assembly. The singers and dancers, the worship team, the visual and dramatic artists, the MCs, the food servers, the help desk volunteers, the hospitality team, even the intentionality and thoughtfulness of printing these bookmarks with the schedule for those who still deal with print, and of creating an app for those who don't deal with print. However, it did make me wonder about the filters that we set up as churches and organizations that sift through the young women and men who start out with equal representation and participation, and yet these filters only allow men of certain age who are fully abled to make it to the decision-making circles. It might be wise to add another I word to this assembly's vision: intergenerational, intentional, and inclusive. I believe that only then can disciple making be truly holistic. The second deep longing that these generations share, not just to belong, but also to be inspired. Generation Y and Z have experienced disappointment in authority figures on every level. Presidents lie, politicians lie, celebrities whom they admire lie, pastors lie, parents lie. They've been lied to way too many times. Trust is lost. That's why they seek transparency and to be in trusting relationships. This highlights the need that Pastor Samuel spoke of yesterday and this morning. Character and credibility is much needed in discipleship making. What could have been hidden in the past is now instantly exposed in social media, and they know it. That's why they're very picky when it comes to where to work. Employees choose who to work for, not the other way around. They want to work for someone who lives and works for a purpose greater than themselves. They want to work for someone who fosters an environment of learning and unlearning. They want to work for someone who believes in sharing economy. Remember, this is the generation that came up with Uber and Lyft and Airbnb and neighbor helping neighbor and person helping person. They want to work for somebody who is determined to impact the world, not just the church. The church is way too isolated for them. Their hearts don't just break over disaster relief and illiteracy and hunger and human trafficking and refugees and violence and war. They're the generation that leaves their friends behind and they step into what we saw in the video, into the pain of the world. They're the ones who want to impact and influence and redeem and change science and health, technology, education, agriculture, medicine, the environment, law and politics, art and music. And if the church can't keep up with them, they will walk away from it. I want to propose to you this morning the model of mutual mentoring among generations. We grow by helping others grow, as Dr. B said this morning. To nurture a leadership culture where there is intergenerational flow of wisdom reciprocity. Older generations need tech translators and digital mentors. Younger generations need the security of tried and tested experiences. The modern leader is no longer the image of reverence, rather the image of relevance. Being a responsive leader is important to be able to be fully present for your people, for their needs, and this is not bound to any one generation. A responsible leader, and I will borrow the words from Dr. James yesterday, is one who is able to stand, to look, to ask, and to walk, to meet the felt needs of his or her community. In this sense, a modern leader can be from any generation. In this sense, intergenerational reciprocity and mutual mentoring is possible. I'd like to close with the biblical metaphor that Jesus offered his disciples when he spoke of garments and wineskins in Luke 5. In this parable, Jesus offers familiar yet vivid illustrations, but he adds his own twist to them. First, he speaks of garments and he says, no one tears a piece out of a new garment to patch an old one. He presents to them the visual of how ridiculous it is to buy a new garment only to tear it. Don't ruin a new garment to patch up an old one. Both will be irreversibly ruined. And then he gives them a second illustration from the art of winemaking. He counsels them, don't put new wine that's ready for vigorous fermentation into old wineskins that have already been stretched. Both will be irreversibly wasted. Here we need to hear Jesus' concern for both the new and the old in these 5 destructive verbs that he uses: torn, not matching, burst, run out, and ruined. He wants nothing to be wasted. He wants to preserve both the old and the new. In the new covenant, old things will be different, not dispersed, not discarded. All things will be made new. I hear the tension here, not so much between old and new, rather I hear the tension between old and renew. The tension is between old and renew. How much is the old willing to be renewed? The old garment can have a renewed usefulness according to this current time and space. Maybe as a sack for dry grain or a protective cover for wood from rain. The old wineskins also can still be useful in this current time and space. Maybe for holding other fluids like water or milk or oil, things that don't need fermenting and therefore will not push it to the edge of bursting. Jesus doesn't want the old garment or the old wineskin damaged. He cares about the old as well as the new. He simply wants to put the old into a proper use given the new time and circumstance. Jesus warns that insisting on using these old items in the same manner as they'd always been used in the past will end up damaging them as well as damaging the new things which are being forced to match and to fit into them. Intergenerational leadership is about discernment, and the task of discernment can be overwhelming at times, but honestly, I don't think I've ever seen a faithful church that is underwhelmed. It is part of the nature of our calling to be the disciples of Christ. Sadly, I have seen it over and over again. Churches that try to preserve the old instead of persevering in renewal. These churches end up perishing. Communities that are not willing to die to themselves for their faith end up having their faith die. A process of irreversible destruction begins to take place unless we stop and behold Jesus, making all things new, including us. Both old and new are called to submit to the renewing movement of the Spirit in order to stay useful in the kingdom of heaven. You make beautiful things out of dust. In conclusion, leadership is about dealing with humans, with the wisdom that can only come from the Holy Spirit. No matter what generation they belong to, each human has his and her unique journey of faith and life. Leadership is complicated because good leaders put people first and people are complex. Leadership is complicated because it reaches into the future and pulls in the kingdom of God into the present. Our disciples today don't need to wait to be the leaders of tomorrow's church. Our disciples today can already become the leaders of today's church, but only if we as leaders help them to first belong and secondly to inspire them, not so much by our leadership, but by our own discipleship. Thank you for listening.